Muy buenas tardes a todos. Good evening, everyone. Soy Cristina Sánchez, vicedecana de investigación de la Facultad de Ciencias Biológicas de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Y os doy la más cordial bienvenida a una nueva sesión del ciclo La biología en los medios. Quiero pediros disculpas porque estamos empezando con unos minutos de retraso, pero hemos tenido unos pequeños problemas técnicos que creo que ya están resueltos. Bueno, como habréis podido ver en el material de difusión de esta actividad, la mayor parte de los ponentes de hoy son angloparlantes, así que, si me lo permitís, pasamos al inglés a partir de este momento. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new activity of our cycle, Biology in the Media. My name is Cristina Sánchez, and I'm the Vice Dean of Research of the School of Biology at Complutense University in Madrid, Spain. For those of you who don't know anything about our cycle, Biology in the Media, our aim is to organize scientific presentations on topics that have a big impact in mass media, in non-specialized media. We have covered news on many different things during the last 3 years. And of course, the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has been the focus of some of our lectures and debates. Today, we're going to talk about this topic, but from a wider perspective. COVID-19 will be just an excuse to think about the role of our species in creating the perfect conditions for diseases to emerge. To do that, we have here today with us not one, but 5 experts on the field that will give us their inputs on this issue. I'm going to introduce the first one of them, who has been the organizer of this roundtable and will act as your host and chairman, our colleague, Richard Williams. Richard has recently joined our school as visiting professor in virology. He was born in the UK, where he did his undergraduate studies and moved to the US for his doctoral research on avian influenza. After that, he did several postdoctoral research stays at Complutense University, Linnaeus University in Sweden, and the University of Derby in the UK. His current research focuses on the study of ecology and evolution of vertebrate pathogens, with a particular focus on avian poxvirus, influenza, and papillomavirus. He's interested in One Health and the impact of human development on pathogen evolution. Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much for putting together this very interesting panel. And before passing the torch to you, let me remind the audience that they can ask questions through the Q&A tool that appears in the bottom part of their screens, and that they can also vote for questions asked by other attendees with the thumbs up feature. So now, Richard, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Christina, for that lovely introduction. And for all the support you've given me in organising this webinar event. I was just giving thanks to Jesus, the Dean of Biology, for developing this series, and to the Foundation Complutense for providing the platform. I also want to warmly welcome our long-suffering panelists who are waiting there patiently to get started with a roundtable webinar on whether virus emergence is caused by man-made environmental change. In the order that I first met them, Town Peterson is Distinguished Professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Kansas. He is Senior Curator of Ornithology at the Biodiversity Institute there, and he also supervised my PhD. Ursula Hoffler is a veterinarian, an Associate Professor and Head of the Avian Diseases and Pathology section at IREC, the Institute of Game and Wildlife Research in Ciudad Real in Spain. You may notice from the name Ursula Hoffler that she is not Spanish. She is from Germany originally, but has lived in Spain for many years. Moving on, Javier Perez is Professor of Zoology in the Department of Biodiversity, Ecology and Evolution at Complutense University, Madrid, and is co-director of the Evolution and Conservation Biology Research Group. And finally, Mark Bulling is a senior lecturer in ecology at the University of Derby in the United Kingdom, and he is the statistical artiste on our panel. Unfortunately, one of our invited panelists Jonas Waldenström, who's a professor of biology at Linnaeus University in Sweden and is the leader of the Zoonotic Ecology and Epidemiology Research Group, has fallen ill, and he cannot attend today. So let's hope he hasn't discovered a new zoonotic disease. I feel I've been too brief in my introductions, because this is a very high-powered group with many achievements between them. But it's time to move on to the actual discussion. I will say they all share one thing, that they produce great, exciting research on disease ecology and evolution, and they're an excellent group to discuss whether virus emergence is a consequence of man-made environmental change. We are currently living through this terrible COVID-19 pandemic. It's killed 4.7, nearly 4.8 million people, probably many, many more. And in recent years, the news has been punctuated with stories about Ebola and Zika, chikungunya, MERS, influenza, Nipah, SARS, so on, loads more. Javi Perez-Tres, could you first of all describe for us what are emerging diseases and what are zoonotic diseases?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Richard, in the first place, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I'm very honored to be here, and I think an emerging disease or an emerging virus, if you want to focus on that, might be defined as a virus which has appeared in a population for the first time, or that may have existed in the population before, but is increasing in incidence. The incidence is a number of new cases per given number of people, or is spreading over geography, so expanding into new areas. So this is the common definition of an emerging virus, to put it in context. Mm-hmm.
And also, what are zoonotic viruses?
Zoonotic viruses are those that spread between animals and people, according to the CDC definition, for example. So many times we think of zoonotic viruses as things that are imported into humans, but it goes both ways. So it's the viruses that we are sharing with animals. So we may be affected by zoonosis that are new to us. And for example, COVID-19 may be a virus of that kind if it is one that has been imported from an animal, although we don't know exactly which one, or we can have viruses that are not new to us, and we worry because they may be emerging or re-emerging. So zoonotic viruses many times are the agents of emerging diseases. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for that. Mm-hmm. We see all of these new viruses, Tam Peterson, and I wanted to ask you, do you think that virus emergence is actually increasing now? And if it is, how do we know that? What sort of evidence is there? Why would it be increasing?
It's a pretty difficult question. If we talk about emergence of viruses, there's a panoply of reasons why, as Javi just said, the virus may be either appearing in a population for the first time or much more frequent in a population. For example, we've had major emergence events that have been related to overcoming dispersal barriers. So for example, West Nile virus was known since the middle 20th century as kind of a minor virus, something not terribly dangerous to humans across Africa, Southern Europe, and Southwest Asia. And then in the late 90s, it managed to make it across the Atlantic Ocean and then spread massively and dramatically across the Americas. And so that was an emergence event that was related to dispersal. Now, there are other examples that may be related to ecological interactions. For example, a new vector species may appear as maybe an invasive species, a non-native species of, let's say, mosquito or tick. And that can then provide a much more active avenue of transmission for a disease that was already there. And so that's essentially emergence via ecological interaction. There are also changes that are evolutionary changes that may make a virus more virulent or more transmissible. And I think most people on Earth have heard of the Delta variant of COVID-19, which took a virus which was kind of modestly transmissible and made it perhaps tenfold more transmissible, essentially better at jumping from one human to another. And then a fourth avenue of emergence, which might be the least interesting, at least to biologists, is that of diagnostic ability, which is to say, sometimes we realize that a disease is more prevalent simply because we're able to characterize it and diagnose it. And so that's not really an emergence, it's more of a realization on the part of humans. So seeing through these, I've listed 4 paths to emergence, to elevating occurrence of a viral disease in a population. Seeing through at least those 4, if not more, paths to emergence, and asking this question rigorously of whether humans are responsible for it, it's not at all easy. And the answer is not at all clear. People will point to climate change, and climate change is warming climates, and perhaps for those of us who live in the temperate zone, bringing some subtropical diseases closer to the temperate zone. But also climate change is doing the opposite and moving some regions out of the optima or the ideal conditions for transmission. So I think it's an open question, and it's something that the research community needs to explore and respond to objectively and carefully to arrive at an answer that is cogent and quantitative and based on information.
I was wondering if anybody else would like to add anything to what Tan was saying there about virus emergence, whether it's increasing, and if there's any evidence along those lines.
I think Tan's point of we don't know a lot, and we need to be very careful and cautious in our interpretation is spot on. And I think it's we don't have enough information, really, in my view, to really look at the mechanistic levels. I think we might be able to look at the quantities, but even then, we've got to look over quite extensive periods of time. If we're going to look at trends, we've got to look over periods of time. And we haven't been monitoring virus emergence in the same way over long periods of time. So we've got biases in the way that we monitor things. And I think it's going to be very, very difficult to pull out the mechanisms specifically until we've got a lot more information. But having said that, I think that we're in an age where we are starting to be able to do that. We've got metagenomics, which is enabling us to monitor things, the environment, human populations at unprecedented levels, both spatially and temporally. So I think we're on a journey where we can't specifically discuss. Well, I don't think we can identify key mechanisms. It's mostly theory at the moment, but we're on a journey where we will start to be able to answer that. And I think it's the monitoring that's going to be important for doing that.
I think you hit on a really interesting point there, that it's very difficult to see a virus. Viruses, of course, are very small. Viruses, of course, have only been known for about 120 years. Of the major groups of organisms, or, some people wouldn't even consider a virus an organism, it's an agent. They are the one that has been known, and we've been able to define it for the least amount of time. And really now, with molecular tools, we are able to provide an objective picture of diversity of viruses. But that, of course, we've only been doing with metagenomics for last 10 years, really, maybe 15, 20, and with less precise or less high throughput techniques for 20 years before that. So that means that we can't even compare what we know from now with what we knew in the past 80 or 100 years. Bearing that in mind, Ursula Hoffler, can I ask you to describe what emerging viruses are like, and if they have common characteristics or if they're very different things?
Go.
There you are.
The virus in my microphone. So it's there are a few characteristics that make it easier for a virus to be more likely to become pandemic. Which doesn't mean that the virus mean to do so. They're not planning for things to happen, at least as far as we know. But some of the common characteristics is that most of the viruses that we, at least the people who work with these things, rank as more likely to provoking pandemics, or they've been involved sort of in the most important disease outbreaks like COVID right now, or avian flu, or Nipah, the Nipah outbreaks. All of these are RNA viruses. In contrast to bacteria or DNA viruses for replication, when these viruses replicate, when they use the cell mechanism for replication and multiplying, they don't have something like a control mechanism that does exist for DNA, organisms that have DNA. So that makes them far more easy, makes mutation in these organisms far more easy, and thus makes them far more adaptable to other organisms, to different situations. And on top of that, some of these RNA viruses have an additional mechanism that makes them even more able to have sort of genetic jumps to adapt to specific situations, which is a very specific characteristic of, for example, influenza viruses, because with their segmented RNA, if two different influenza viruses infect the same cell in the same organism, they can actually exchange gene fragments. And that's how some of the more important influenza viruses in the past have emerged. Other things they have in common is that many of the viruses that we know, and probably others that we don't know, that have been related to pandemics, have been able to jump between species. A lot of viruses normally have their specific ecological needs, their specific host species, and they're very related to this species, but some viruses are able to jump between species. Some viruses are actually generalists to start with, and those do better in terms of changing between species. And also very often the viruses that may become related to pandemics are transmitted, for example, easily between individuals, because, for example, one of the differences between COVID-19 and some of the other coronaviruses that have emerged earlier than COVID-19, like the SARS, the first SARS-CoV virus or the MERS virus, that are really, in terms of fatality, much worse than COVID-19, but that fortunately haven't been able to transmit as easy between individuals. And generally, many of these viruses, and that's one of the other characteristics, is that they are generally respiratory pathogens, so they are transmitted easily via they're airborne. So direct contact or close contact, even not is sufficient to allow them to transmit. So these would be one of the 4 characteristics that they're not exclusive, but they're definitely some of the 4 characteristics that are part of the picture of a virus that's maybe able to emerge as a pandemic agent.
The mutagenesis, the fact that they evolve very quickly is, of course, very worrying, specifically in terms of vaccination and how quickly vaccines or how long vaccines might work. And very interesting that you're focusing on the RNA viruses, which certainly in recent times, they've been the worst viruses that have affected us, obviously COVID or influenza and so on. But the worst virus that I can think of for hitting humans was smallpox, of course, which was a DNA virus. And we've successfully got rid of smallpox through vaccination, haven't we? Could anybody add something on smallpox here now? In Town, you look like you're wanting to jump in.
I was just going to ask the question of whether you would consider smallpox as an emerging virus, because we're talking about virus emergence, or rather as an endemic virus, because I think it had been in human populations for very long times. So I don't know enough about the history of smallpox, but would you have considered it an emerging virus? I don't know.
I think at different points in its relationship, its ecology with humans, it must have been an emerging virus. I think that's something that happens, but it's a good point. It's not really an emerging virus in the sense that COVID is currently springing itself on us today. So I'm going to change the topic a little bit now. So far, we've talked about viruses, but that's only part of our question. And so Mark Bulling, could you talk to us a little bit about what we mean by man-made environmental change and what aspects of environmental change might be important to disease emergence?
Yeah, firstly, somebody spotted that my room is getting very dark. I just wanted to explain that there are very heavy rain clouds that are descending where I live, and currently the rain is thundering down. So it's not nighttime. It's just part of the weather, which might be quite relevant actually. So it's part of the environment. So I think when we're talking about the environment, it might be quite good to just take a step back and think about what we mean by the environment from an organism point of view. So if you think of a single organism, it's embedded in the environment. And we tend to think of that environment as being composed of 2 components. We've got the abiotic, the non-living, and we've got the biotic, the living. So we've got the abiotics, things like temperature, humidity, water, chemistry, etc. And then we've got the biotic, which are the other living organisms in the environment. And of course, those are all integrated. They're not separate. They're very much interacting with each other and part of the whole environment. And we've got to remember, I think, that the environment is a dynamic system. So even if humans weren't here, the environment would be, there would be fluxes, there would be changes, populations would be changing, there'd be community dynamics, there would be biogeochemistry processes. So the environment is not in a steady state, but it does tend to be in a fairly stable condition. So it doesn't tend to wander out of a sort of restricted range of possibilities. So I guess in terms of human impact, we can regard any human-sourced or source of impact as human impact. But I think that what we're concerned with here are impacts from humans that perturb the ecosystem to states that it probably wouldn't have reached if we weren't here. So we're talking about fairly large perturbations. So, of course, one of the main examples is global warming. We've got ocean acidification, pollution. We've got microplastics in the oceans. In terrestrial systems, they're all over the place. So I think these are the sorts of things that we tend to think about when we are talking about human intervention, or human impacts. But I think we should also recognize that there are local impacts. Going out and cutting down a tree will have a significant impact at a local level. If we expand that up, that's going to have a big impact on a larger scale. So it's more this perturbation. I think human impacts, or my focus is on these larger scale impacts that perturb the ecosystems from their normal functioning. In terms of disease, I think this comes back to some of the points that Town made earlier. I think what we're doing with our impacts is we're creating novel environments. We're creating novel combinations in our environments in terms of the abiotic and biotic. And then if you link that with the points that Ursula was making in terms of rapid evolution, this combination of viruses which can evolve rapidly, being exposed to novel environments is likely to lead to, I think, an increase in the emergence of new viruses, or at least new strains of viruses. So what are the most important aspects of change? I'm not sure that I've got the answer to that, because I think that there are different ways of looking at it. So, for example, we could be looking at, let's just take scale. So I mentioned global warming. That's a large-scale change that we're instigating in the globe. So we would expect that to be having effects all across the globe, which may then, so we may then regard climate warming as a key impact, which is going to affect the emergence of viruses. But I think that the emergence of viruses, again, coming back to, I think, Town's point about transmissibility, sometimes you need small local events to have big consequences. So you might be thinking about a new virus that's emerged, and the right conditions, it's in a small area, but it needs a host or a potential host to encounter that virus in order to take off or spread. And that's a small chance event, and that could be down to a small local event. So I think that the other key thing is aspects that we're changing is this aspects related to transmissibility. We as humans are moving around an awful lot. We're exploring a lot more of the globe. We're moving animals around. We're moving plants around. So we've got this great big movement, and we're changing the patterns of spread. And I think that my take on it is that the large global change with this increase in movement of humans, animals, plants, those are the key aspects that we should be keeping an eye on.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's a big answer there. I had one little additional question. How long has environmental change been going on for, or human-made environmental change? Is it very recent? Is it something, it's kind of my dad's fault, or has it been going on for a longer time?
Good question, yeah. I think that, if you're an organism in the environment, you're going to be affecting it. Then it comes down to this scale. So I think that as soon as humans were around, they were having an impact because they were gathering resources and affecting the environment. I think becomes a question then is, when did we significantly start to impact the environment? And I think that we've been doing that since we emerged, because we would have been, well, I guess since we started to form groups, civilizations, and that's been having an impact. But I think that if you look at the overall scale of the impact that we're having and the rapidity, then it's in much more recent times that we've been impacting. So that's a fairly sort of vague answer, because I think that what we've been doing is impacting since we emerged. But I think the scale of impact has been increasing dramatically. And I think most people would probably put it on an exponential scale.
That's very interesting, an exponential scale. I particularly like the comparison with us and some kind of emerging virus, by the way. Javi, I'll bring you back in after some time without joining in. So can we combine a couple of the ideas we talked about? So we've got virus emergence maybe or maybe not increasing, and this is in a period of our intense man-made change. So is there any coincidence in these two things?
Well, I think this is another very difficult question to answer. I mean, my belief is that it is not a coincidence. Probably there's a lot of causal effects going on that we're causing things, and at the same time, as Tom, for example, explained before, now we have a better. We are much better prepared to detect, for example, new viruses, to increase the diversity of known viruses and so on. So we know many more viruses now because we have better tools to study them. But I think that thanks to the studies of epidemiologists, we understand quite well the factors that may affect the disease transmission rate, and as we were discussing before, Mark was talking about that. We have, for example, now much bigger contact rates between people, and this will increase the spread of diseases. So we know very well, for example, from COVID pandemics, that the contact between people increases the virus spread, and what happens from person to person at a local scale may also happen at a greater scale due to traveling or commerce, for example. So globalization, which is another of the consequences of the global change, or another of the expressions, I would say, of global change, has increased contact rates, and this has created opportunities for viruses to spread and emerge locally. We were talking before, for example, about whether smallpox was an endemic or an emerging virus. I would say it was an endemic virus that turned into an emerging virus when it was transported to the Americas by Europeans, for example, and that created a big problem and caused a lot of mortality in populations that were not adapted to coexisting with that disease. To them, it was a novel disease. So I think this is one important part, and another idea that makes me think that is not a coincidence that virus emergence is increasing precisely now is that the impact of our activities is on ecosystems. I mean, the impact on ecosystems is changing the structure of biological interactions. We were talking about that before as well. So, and this will include the disease dynamics. So classical virus reservoirs may increase abundance. They may become more easily infected, for example, or may come into closer contact with people, and this may depend on the way we interact with nature. So we are becoming now more and more aware of that one of the big services that biodiversity gives to us for free is protection against disease, and I think is all related with this idea that the change in the structure of interactions between animals disease agents and ourselves is changing a lot with our impact on ecosystems. So yeah, definitely, I think it is not a coincidence.
That's, I guess, part of the heart of this debate we're having here, and we will come back to this point again.
Mm-hmm.
But for now, I'm going to deviate again, and I'm going to ask my first really polemic question. And I think it's only fair I ask this to our American. So, Donald Trump called COVID the Wuhan virus or the China virus, and he blames China in part for the current pandemic. Is it fair that lots of viruses emerge from China? And why did COVID come out of China?
Well, I thought we weren't going to mention that name in this event, but one of the worst things that former president of the U.S. did was to take things that should not be political and make them political, and he did it both in the sense of essentially accusing China and in the sense of polarizing pandemic responses here within the US, which I'm guessing has led to hundreds of thousands of extra deaths because a portion of our population saw it as a political thing not to wear a mask or not to get vaccinated. Now, your question is about, do all nasty viruses come from China? No. Okay. If we just go back through recent history of emerging viruses, we can think about Zika, so Africa, chikungunya, which seems to have come from perhaps Indian Ocean rim or Pacific Islands, big Ebola emergence, which was in West Africa. And certainly we can go back farther and get to SARS, the first SARS, which came from East Asia. But this idea of the Wuhan virus, it's almost certainly not from Wuhan in China, and there's this accusation of laboratory either purification, isolation, or manufacture. There's quite a literature about that question. Does not seem to have resolved anything, but it also doesn't seem that there's any compelling evidence that this is anything other than a naturally occurring virus, probably is commensal with a wild bat in East Asia. And it saw an ecological opportunity in jumping to a new host, maybe directly to humans, maybe via an intermediate, probably a mammal host. You've heard a lot of discussion of pangolins. There's not a lot of evidence that is really compelling in any of those directions, but there seems to be no evidence other than suspicion and politics that suggests that this is something that came from China as a political entity, as a national entity, came from East Asia as a place with bats that host this sort of virus. They've given rise to one previous major outbreak closely related to COVID-19. So this idea of from that president that I won't name, this idea that all nasty viruses come from China, it's based in ignorance and it's based in politics, and it's disappointing. The president of the United States should be more mature and more measured. It's a global crisis, and we all should react in concert rather than accusing one another and pointing fingers.
That was a very, very thorough answer, which I think you're absolutely right that we have to avoid polarizing the pandemic response. And I think you're right that your Lord Voldemort was, whose name shall not be mentioned again, should not have been using it in the political way he was. And very interesting to hear there's no compelling evidence of anything emerging from labs, and that here we have an ecologically opportunist virus that's expanding into a new host or new hosts undetermined at the moment. I think that China's a very interesting country, though, just because it's so big in terms of human population, in terms of the way it's changing at the moment. And in a lot of ways, it's providing, in a relatively small space, it's showing a lot of changes that are applied to the whole world, but perhaps it's in quite a relatively small geographical area for it. Is there anybody here who would like to argue at all with Town about China being an area that, not exactly argue with Town, but add a couple of different viewpoints to what Town was saying? Or do I have to take the Donald Trump posture myself?
I'll jump in and argue with Town that we have a body of theory about disease ecology, usually under the umbrella of the term dilution effect. And this is the idea that intact, diverse biological systems essentially buffer against epidemic disease transmission. I think Javi mentioned this already. And in that sense, the very dense, very large human population in China and the massive scale environmental perturbation could have had something to do with the opportunity to jump from the zoonotic world, from the world of wildlife, to the human world. But it was one event. And those unique events happen in Africa with Ebola and in America with our hantaviruses. They happen the world over because perturbation of natural systems is a global phenomenon, and it's a dominant phenomenon of the last several centuries. So I don't see that China is unique in that. But you could say that massive scale environmental perturbation might lend itself to disease epidemics. And that's not an accusation unique to China.
Absolutely not. That's something that's been going on all over the world for many years. China happens to be developing very fast right now with lots of people, perhaps in a biodiversity hotspot in a large, or some parts of it, in a large geographical area. So there are many potential interactions, as Javi was saying. Lots of new things could be happening. Perhaps farming techniques or farming of animals that previously were not farmed. I'm again going to jump away and change the direction a little bit.
And I'm just add a small clarification. Maybe it's not as clear. It's basically adding on to Towns and Javier's comments and clarifying a little bit when we talked about RNA viruses as more potential pandemic organisms. One of the things and about mutation, this is something that's happening all the time, but it's probably what's important about this is that it's a matter of frequency and a matter of opportunity, which is basically what Town and Javier were mentioning. Most of these mutations are not viable. It's just there's sort of errors in code, and many of these virus offspring that result from these mutations won't survive and won't be able to go anywhere. But and at the same time, one of the things, for example, we've been seeing with COVID is that when people went back and looked at bats and looked at people around bats, is that transmission of viruses between bats or wild animals and domestic animals or people happens all the time, but most of the time it doesn't go anywhere because these viruses are not able to adapt to this host or whatever. But if we increase frequency, if we allow, or if contact is increased with all these changes we've been inflicting, then the opportunity is far bigger. And so there's an argument both for China, but for any large global scale change. I just wanted to sort of clarify how mutation of, or potential for mutation in the RNA viruses is a part of this equation, and how the changes allowing this are important.
So having a large population of hosts, which could be human, or it could be domestic animals, or it could be wild animals, and that could be a single species system, or a virus that could infect multiple different species. That's going to increase, having that large reservoir of hosts, that's increasing the possibility for mutation, which is increasing the possibility for something really nasty. Or
yes, definitely. And if we provide homogeneous ecosystems, like large populations of one species, name it humans, pigs, chickens, whatever, it's easier. It's obviously the opportunity is more frequent. That's where the biodiversity point comes in again. It's much easier to adapt to one specific environment than to a lot of different environments.
Okay. So I'm going to change subject slightly again. So in my life, I see that there have been two viral pandemics. One of them is HIV/AIDS, a pandemic that emerged in the 1980s and has killed about 36 million people so far, and it seems pretty endemic in the human population now. And COVID-19, which needs no further introduction. So Mark Bulling, how often do viruses emerge, and how often should we expect a pandemic like we have now?
I don't know. I think that the points that have been raised just recently in the discussion are very pertinent to this, because if you think about the emergence of a virus, a viable virus leading to an endemic, pandemic, etc., there's a whole series of chance events or probabilistic events. So we call it a stochastic process. And for that endemic or pandemic to occur, a series of those events have to happen. And there's a high probability that not all of them are going to occur and you won't get the endemic. So it's not an easy process. It's not like switching on an engine to a car and you can say, okay, the electric current goes from here to here and so on. So we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. So to answer that question, we have to turn to probability. So one thing that has been found, I think, is that I know I'm in dark. I'm going to wave my arms around here a little bit to try and illustrate this. But if you imagine a plot, a graph, and on the x-axis, you've got size or intensity, because I don't think we can separate the question from how often we're going to get something like an endemic from dealing with the size of the endemic, because endemics breakouts are different intensities. So on the x-axis, we have the intensity, which could be related, probably should be related to the numbers of individuals that are infected and the time over which the endemic lasts. So we have small low intensity endemics on the left, and then the x-axis extends to large intensity endemics on the right. And then on the y-axis, we've got the frequency, or the relative frequencies of endemics. And we basically have a downward curve. And this is telling us that we are more likely to get small endemics, or there's going to be a higher frequency of small or low intensity endemic outbreaks, and relatively few large intensity endemics. And that form of the curve, I think that there's arguments over the exact form, but I think that general form with a long tail at the high intensity end, we can be fairly certain that it's something of that shape, because that comes from basic probability theory. And there are a lot of other events, risk-based events, where we see that behavior. So, for example, the frequency of meteorite or sizes of meteorites hitting the Earth's atmosphere follows that curve. The question is, what are the actual numbers on that curve? So we can say something about the form of the curve, but we can't say, I think it's very difficult to say something about the actual risk. But I did find a recent paper by Marani et al., which came out quite recently, and they've had a go at doing this by looking at information on endemics. So this is not just viral endemics, this is all diseases over a 400-year period. So they went back right through all the records they could find. And they did some estimates, and there are a lot of caveats to the way that they did this, but I think it's a very good first stab at this. And to answer your question, which is remarkable that I can actually give you a specific thing here, is that they came to the conclusion that during a human's lifespan currently, the risk of having or being exposed to a COVID-19 level endemic outbreak is around about, or the likelihood is around about 38%. So that seems quite high, but to link it back to the overall question of the discussion, there's quite a lot of, it's not really conclusive, but I think there's quite a lot of evidence supporting the fact that risk is now increasing. And remember, this is not just for viruses, this is for all forms of infection. And many people are linking that with climate change. So does that answer your question, Richard?
It certainly is a very good answer. So is it going to happen again next week? This is something that I think this is where probability comes in. We can, and again, I think this comes to when you're talking about these sorts of things, you're talking about long-term risk over long periods of time. So we can describe the overall frequencies of those intensities over a long period of time, but we can't say what's going to happen next year or 5 years' time. We can just look at the probability of something happening and the scale of what happens. And so probable risk may be increasing, and on the other hand, we've had a couple of these events in a lifetime, so hopefully there won't be another one too soon. So Ursula, I'm quite interested in disease just in wild birds that maybe doesn't really have any big impact on our understanding of human disease, or do you think that's important work? Does it matter if there's a nasty virus in an unimportant wild species?
Oh, probably there's a personal bias in my answer because I'm interested in diseases in wild birds as well. But I think it actually is because a lot of when we talk about unimportant species, we may think about species like sparrows, which is really abundant, and it's actually very closely related to humans. On the other hand, they're potentially, when we think about contaminants, exposed to similar things that we are, because they live with us in the cities, and they could potentially be very good models of what could happen in the future to us, and how things are changing, and how just an example, and going away from the sparrows, disease emergence is not something that only happens to humans. It happens to animals all the time. We probably know more about it in domestic animals, but it happens in wildlife all the time as well. And when we think about disease emergence, we generally think about one pathogen that enters a population or suddenly spreads to another continent, as for West Nile virus, as Town was exemplifying earlier. But there are actually other situations where disease agents may interact, which are even much more complicated scenarios. And for example, for flaviviruses, what happened to humans can be seen on occasions first in birds in the same regions. Has been shown in Greece, for example, that in regions where you find magpies that carry West Nile virus are likely regions that later in the year you will find outbreaks in humans and the human population. Or if we think about other flaviviruses, they appear first in the bird population, then in other populations. Or current outbreaks with a virus that we don't really know about in humans, and that's been found serologically in humans in India, but that has now appeared in Europe, but in birds, and may in the future become important or not, which is another flavivirus, such as Bagatha virus. And this virus, for example, interacts with malaria parasites in birds. So I think there's a lot of things that are easier to see in other species, and that may or may not be important for humans in the short run, but may give clues to understand what could be happening in the future in long term in birds, because they have, small birds at least, passerines have short turnover times for generations. And so things are happening much more quicker than in humans, for example, that have long generations. So it's sort of a experimental model. Birds are one experimental model. We could think about rodents, which is actually the model for experimental disease research in captivity, models hamsters and all these species with short generation times as well. So, but birds are relatively easy to study because they're potentially somewhat easier to study than rodents, because they're more readily easy to see and to catch than rodents. So yes, I think it's definitely important, and it definitely they can signpost things that may be important for us as a population.
I'm very relieved to hear you say that, because it makes me feel that my career is all worthwhile. Otherwise, I'd be worrying about what I'm doing. I am noticing time going by. We're, in terms of when we're supposed to have started at 5, well, we didn't start till 5:20, so we're nearly through an hour. And I was wondering, Christina, if you wanted to give us any questions from the audience, or if I should.
Sure, I can take care of that if you want. And there has been 3 questions that have been already answered by members of the panel, but I don't know if you think that any of them deserves further comments. For example, the first one was sent by Adrian, and he asked, how long does it take for the viruses to mutate enough to be considered a new variant? I don't know if Town or Ursula wants to add something to their answers.
I would just mention that, while now that Richard made this in part a political roundtable and mentioned the name that shouldn't be mentioned, this country, and I'm certain it's not the only country that has had this attitude. This country, you'll hear the comment of America first. And so, access to vaccines was prioritized here. And then only secondarily was there a view to the whole world. Now, if you have 16 billion vaccine doses, then I made that number up. Shouldn't we just make sure that every human on Earth gets vaccinated as soon as possible? And that's where this question becomes very relevant. Every human on Earth who's infected with, in this case, COVID-19, is holding a population of virus. And if you think about it, the global population of COVID-19 now is massively larger than what it was when COVID-19 was a zoonosis and was sitting in some bat in East Asia. And so all of those humans that hold COVID-19 populations are essentially experiments for when and if mutations are generated. Mutations are generated all the time, but a mutation that either makes COVID more transmissible, more virulent, or worse yet, both. And it may not be a single mutation. I tried to give an answer to the question about this. It may be a constellation of mutations that gradually or piecemeal make the virus a different and more dangerous thing. But in that sense, the idea of America first or Europe first or New Zealand first or whatever is a really stupid and ignorant idea, because a virus variant that is generated anywhere on Earth can spread globally, and we've already seen that happen, in a matter of, weeks. So America first, send those vaccines everywhere, especially if Americans don't want to get vaccinated. So just following Richard's political comment, just a bit more.
Well, thank you, Tom. And I hope that those people that are still reluctant to get vaccinated heard your message. And we have another question from the audience. In this case, is from our dean. He says hi, Jesus Perez Gil, and he asked, how important can be environmental changes for virus emergence and spreading compared to globalization? Or perhaps human globalization should be considered, in fact, as a major contribution to environmental impact. So do you want to add anything to your reply?
I can add something, I think. I completely agree. And I'd say that environmental change and globalization are sort of basically part of the same problem. I think globalization is leading to strong environmental change. And I think that somebody mentioned the economy earlier. And I think that all of this is interlinked very closely with the economy. So we've got globalization, and that's driven by economic drivers, the need for economies to expand. Globalization is leading to increasing travel, increasing connectivity, which we've discussed is an important contribution to the likely emergence of novel viruses. And I think that it links back with the political side of things, because globalization is an primarily economic driver, but what is driving that economics is politics. So I think that it's a very important point that we can't just sort of sit down and say these are the things that are driving virus emergence and this is potentially how we control it. I think we've also got to take into account what's driving us and what's driving the economy and the politics. And unfortunately, I don't think we can separate politics from these. So I'd say that I agree that it's all integrated. You can't separate them. And which is more important? It is which one's driving which. I'm not sure.
Okay, we have another question from another member of our staff, Merche Martín Cereceda. And she asked whether you think that the viruses are nowadays evolving at a quicker, wittier pace than they used to do 20, 30 years ago. And we are really witnessing novel and more complex models of viral evolution. Or are we just part of a normal historic cycle of evolution? And it is only that now we are putting more money, brains, and logistics into the exploration of the virosphere. And therefore, we are seeing and learning more of their ways of living and surviving.
I think I would go back to the kind of breakdown of emergence causes that I mentioned earlier in the event. I think without a doubt, we're seeing disease emergence events that spring from dispersal far more frequently. You know, my grandparents each crossed the Atlantic Ocean one time in their respective lives. And I crossed the Atlantic Ocean, except for 2020 and 2021, I crossed the Atlantic Ocean several times a year. And the same applies to materials and animals. So I think we see a lot of disease emergence events that are a result of dispersal, magnification, shall we say, quite a bit more now. Probably ecological change also. Which is to say, we see this intrusion of humans into natural environments. Probably diagnostic change also. Again, I'm referring back to my earlier comments. The diagnostic tools that we have are unbelievable with metagenomics and things like that. But coming to Merche's question, and hi Merche, it's nice to see you, kind of. Coming back to Merche's question, evolutionary change, that to me is one that's been very sticky, because what I see in the disease world is that when you see a change in behavior of a disease, many times the first thing that is done is to appeal to evolutionary change. Evolutionary change is in there and it's happening, it's part of it. But many times I think it's an ecological change or a dispersal change or even a diagnostic change that produces that apparent emergence or that emergence. So I think the burden is on the scientific community to do a better job of distinguishing between emergence events that derive from evolutionary change versus emergence events that are driven by other things.
Thank you for that. We have another question from Leslie James, and the question is whether this debate that we are having this evening would apply to bacteria.
Astrid, do you want to answer that? Oh, sorry. Javi, do you want to answer?
Oh, well, I was going to say just that, of course, it would apply to bacteria and to any other disease agent, because there's, I think it's every disease that is transmitted from animals to humans or back or between animals and so on is susceptible to emerge, and the battery of the toolkit we have to study this problem with different diseases is basically shared. So it's basically the same. So the concepts and the way we think about that and the way we approach the problems is the same. It doesn't matter if it is viruses or bacteria or any other disease. But I think Ursula may enrich this answer, I think.
I sort of answered a little bit, but I've tried to shorten to cut it down to a very short answer in the text. But a lot of it, definitely, yes. There's some differences, obviously, and not only bacteria, as Javi said. I mean, there are a lot of protozoal diseases. Thinking about malaria or other blastocystis or other. So it's a lot of different organisms that can emerge. There's some particularities. For example, change in bacteria is probably a lot slower than in RNA viruses, for instance. But and a few differences. But in general, as Javi said, there's a lot that's similar. So yes, definitely, a lot of what we've been talking about applies to bacteria as well, to protists, even large parasites.
Large parasites, yes. I saw one other question that was asked.
We have two more questions from the audience. One is actually has 3 votes, so I think we should go ahead and ask it. Could be the case is from Vicente, and he's asking, could be the case that COVID-19 was being manipulated in a natural way, in other words, with the aim of researching, originating from the wild environment and eventually escaped from that Wuhan lab in a similar way than that foot and mouth disease escaped from a lab in the UK?
Difficult question.
I think that's a really interesting question for which we have absolutely no evidence. And yeah, maybe it could be, but this could have arisen stochastically because that's viruses mutate, and it's quite plausible, and probably the most plausible thing, that there are many potentially nasty pathogens that don't need any human manipulation to be nasty pathogens. It's interesting to note is to compare out, escapes from a lab in the UK, and there have been escapes from plenty of labs all over the world, and other biosafety problems. For instance, if we think about HIV/AIDS, we know that a lot of people are infected through blood transfusion. So human interventions directly influence infection with viruses or with other agents. And so we get back to, could something happen in a lab? Could it escape, and could it cause a pandemic? We're asking this question, and that's an example of environmental change. 2,000 years ago, we couldn't answer that question because nobody was playing with viruses in the lab. But there's certainly no evidence for it. I don't know if anybody else would like to jump on in there and add anything to what I just said.
Not really. I think it's just as you said. We as a group don't have any evidence for that, and the people thinking about Peter Daszak, or the people that have been more specifically working on this and actually traveling there, they don't apparently have any evidence for this. So it doesn't mean it's completely impossible, but and things have happened before, so it's something that, but it seems to be highly unlikely, and there are other there's evidence there's actually emergence of a coronavirus, pathogenic coronavirus, has happened before. It's just that this coronavirus hasn't been able to transmit between people, and that's been traced back very clearly to wildlife consumption and wet markets. So not really something we can answer here, but I would think it's not very evident. There's not much evidence for it.
Okay, and we have one more question from the audience, from Stella. She asks whether you think that domestic pets as a vector or intermediate host is concerning. It's a concerning issue.
I think definitely as long as they are in close contact with us. So many diseases are I mean, they have pets as the main reservoir or the major reservoir that is transmitting the infection to us. For example, rabies. I think in humans, 99% of cases come from dog bites. And the dogs are domestic animals, so they are pets. And I mean, it can be actually free-ranging pets or dogs in this case, but our willingness to have pets around is causing problems to us from that side, and it happens to other parasites or other disease agents like toxoplasmosis with cats and many others. So definitely, pets are. I mean, they come with costs to us in terms of disease. Mm-hmm.
Should we then stop having pets, or to take it slightly further? The question was about pets, but I think that livestock must be quite a good potential reservoir for diseases. Should we stop eating meat to reduce risk of zoonotic disease?
I wouldn't be so straight or so radical. I think I said that having pets comes with a cost, but I would also take the benefits on the other side of the balance. So I think it's important to have a happy life and so on. And this explains much of why we have pets and livestock. But definitely, I mean, if we think of the animals that are more prone to transmit viruses or other diseases to us, then you have to think of the animals we raise, the pets, I mean, hens, chicken, livestock in general. They are the ones that live closer to us, and the ones we eat, the ones we interact the most with. So they are definitely carriers of diseases to us. Mm-hmm.
I'm both a chicken owner and I'm a dog owner, so I'm glad that I don't have to get rid of any of my pets.
Richard, I actually have to go and teach now.
You did warn me.
Yeah. My students are now waiting. So I'd just like to say thank you very much to everybody, and well done, Richard, for dealing with the initial problems, and well done for organising it. It was nice to talk to all of you, and well done, Christina. You handled all the problems very smoothly, very well. So I better rush, and good luck with the rest of the discussion.
Thanks very much for joining us, Mark. Your contribution has been very, very stimulating, interesting, and you handled a couple of really tricky questions I threw at you very well. So thank you for putting in the effort and all the research you've done to do it so well.
Thanks, Richard. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
I wonder if that's a good moment for us to wrap this up. I would like to have a wrapping up question, though. I'm sorry that Mark can't be one of the people who contributes to this, although I think everyone we still have with us is going to be able to add a lot to the question. It's really just to bring us back to the title of this talk. So we've discussed viruses and the climate they live in quite broadly. We've got a very clear idea of some of the pressures our environment is facing at present. So did COVID, Ebola, SARS, bird flu, West Nile, did they just happen? Or are we authors of our own misfortune? Who's putting their hand up?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer again. So Yeah, you're very unfair. But I think, probably in some cases, we played a relevant role in setting up the system to create those diseases. For example, I was thinking of. I'm not really an expert about that, but I was reading about the Nipah virus, for example, and apparently one thing that was important for the spread of that virus was that the bats that were apparently the original reservoir of the viruses were getting close to pigs, just because the natural habitats of the bats were deforested. And then the bats were attracted to fruits. I mean, they were frugivorous bats, and the fruits were around the pigs. In the big farms. So they were bringing loads of bats, like creating a massive population of bats near to the pigs, and the droppings of the bats were contaminating the food of the pigs. So if this is true, I'm not sure if the story is totally settled, but I think it's quite well analyzed. Yeah, then you see all the ingredients of the problem in that story. So you have the man-made changes in the environment that were not really directly connected to the spread of the viruses, but were changing the interactions between animals, pigs and bats in this case, and were creating an opportunity for the disease that was confined to the bats to spread into pigs, and then from pigs to jump into humans, maybe. So that's, I think, one of the cases that tell us that we are probably playing a very relevant role in spreading diseases that affect us and affect wildlife in general. So I would say, from my side, I would say, yes, this is a problem, but probably it's not the only reason why this happens. So a difficult question.
Town or Ursula, do you have anything to add?
I very much agree with Javier's answer. If we look back now with the new tools we have, there seems to be evidence that, for example, the coronaviruses that cause the common colds that we have now and that are endemic in our population, at some time point in the 19th century, were a spillover from wildlife as well. And that's probably when man-made change was less important. So it's sort of an evidence. So we've got sort of both sides of the equation. We've probably are accelerating this, and we've definitely a big role in many of the cases. But on the other hand, it's probably something that would happen eventually, occasionally for some viruses at some point, even without the opportunities we are creating. But there's definitely with a lot of the more recent diseases, there's a lot of what we've been doing and what we've been changing has contributed to what's happening.
I would echo what Javier and Ursula had to say, but maybe just with the added comment that when an event starts, we oftentimes make it quite a bit worse with our behavior. So we may be the authors of our own pandemics instead of local outbreaks. And the clear illustration of that is the airline industry. We really could stay locked down quite a bit longer if we genuinely cared about reducing and essentially putting out this current pandemic. But the airline industry is very eager to get us back to our old habits of flying between continents and between countries and between states and moving. I mean, obviously this is not to move the disease around, but that's the effect. And of course, the airline industry is their goal is to make money. And so the real fault is with us, where we don't give up our habits. And yet, this webinar is a wonderful illustration of how we can be on different continents and still get together and interchange ideas
without infecting each other. without infecting each other.
But also,
Safe webinars.
I can be in Spain this morning and in Brazil this afternoon without, flying madly around the world. And so hopefully this is something that we can think about as a positive outcome from COVID-19, that we can move around less, have more quality time with families and such, and also reduce our carbon footprints by moving a lot of our international and interregional interactions online.
That's definitely right. I'd like to thank you very much for coming and for sharing your ideas with us. I know it's been a big time commitment for you all, and early morning there, or relatively early morning there in America, and you've had to invest time in preparing your answers for this difficult talk. And I've been really stimulated by this, and I hope we can work this up together in some way. I'll certainly be looking into doing that. So thank you very much. And audience, thank you very much for coming and attending and asking us some really stimulating questions. And for being interested in what we're working on. And of course, Christina, I think you've done a marvelous job when I was running around, not being very helpful. And I'm sorry that was such a farce at the beginning.
Well, it was not a big of a deal, so don't worry. And we have been recording the session, and we will do they will do some editing, and people won't know that we had technical issues, so no problem, don't worry. And I just want to wrap up the session by thanking, of course, the panelists. And I think we all have a lot of take-home messages, very interesting take-home messages to discuss and to think about. And I want to thank you, Richard, for organizing this panel. It was an honor to welcoming you into our staff. And I think this is just the first of many activities that you're going to organize, and a lot of things that you're going to do for the School of Biology and for our university. So thank you very much for choosing us. And thank you very much for organizing this event. And just let me finish by thanking the staff at the Fundación General de la UCM for their technical assistance, and also our colleagues from Colegio Oficial de Biólogos de la Comunidad de Madrid, which have sponsored also this event. And thank you, the audience, of course, for being there. That's the only reason why we do these things. And please take care, and we hope to see you soon in the next event. So thank you all. Bye.